This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so yeah, that's me. The science center used to let me take some nice pictures of plankton. I spent a lot of time in Prince William Sound studying the oceanography, studying zooplankton in the sound, so that's what I got to do for a lot of years. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about probably for the next half hour or so is first and foremost, what is mariculture? I've had several conversations with community members where I start talking about, grow lines and kelp seed, and they just kind of stop me and are like, what actually is mariculture? So we're going to start there. Since this is kind of a sciencey talk, I'm not going to let you guys get away with not having a little biology, so we're going to talk about kelp biology, the difference between kelp and actual plants, environmental impacts of kelp forests and kelp farming. How do you grow kelp? What does a kelp farm look like, and what are the techniques used? Finally, once you have all that kelp that you've produced, what kind of products can you make? What can you do with that kelp? And finally, there's been a lot of questions about where the kelp farms are in the Sound. So I have a couple of slides for all the mariners to take a look at that to make sure nobody's riding into a kelp farm in the middle of the night, because unfortunately they're not on the NOAA charts. Okay, so first and foremost, what is mariculture? Mariculture is any sort of cultivation or farming of marine organisms for food, for other products in the open ocean. So you can do mariculture in the Sound, but you can't do mariculture in Kansas. Any sort of aquaculture that's happening in a controlled environment, you can do in places like Kansas. So when you hear the word aquaculture, that can be done anywhere in tanks in sort of some sort of controlled environment. But with mariculture, it's specifically talking about farming in the ocean. I just want to reiterate that caged farm and salmon, any sort of farmed or any sort of fin fish farming is prohibited by law in Alaska. So at no point in time are we going to have salmon cages in the water. So all right, so a little bit of biology. I'll roll you back to high school biology class for a few minutes. I just want to talk about the differences between plants and seaweed, and why seaweed are not plants. Seaweed are much more simple. Plants are way more complex. Can I have that clicker just to have the?
Yeah.
Okay. So here we have our little seed. I think this might be some sort of bean that you might grow in class. On this plant, we have leaves. We have this nice stem, and then we have roots. Now this plant's growing medium is the soil. So the roots are in the soil. The leaves are taking up sunlight, converting it into sugars through photosynthesis, and sending it down the chute right here to the roots, because the roots can't photosynthesize on their own. They are completely dependent on the leaves for all sorts of food and sugar. So plants have leaf systems, shoot systems, and root systems. Each one of these systems is very complex. It's made up of different types of cells that serve different types of functions. So if you've ever heard the term xylem, phloem, those are very complicated different types of cell structures. For us and for our presentation, kelp don't have any of that. They're very simple organisms. Every single tiny cell in this kelp body can basically sustain itself and live on its own. It doesn't need any sort of nutrients coming from the roots in order to grow, and it doesn't need any sunlight that's coming only from the leaves and sugar that's only coming from the leaves for it to grow. So with plants, the reproductive structure in flowering plants, plants and seaweed are very complicated. There are all sorts of exceptions to the rules. But we're just going to use flowers as the example for what produces the reproductive tissue and the reproductive structure. In seaweed, that's called a sorus, sori plural, and that's going to be important in a couple of slides. But for our very simple kelp body, we have a holdfast down here. It may look kind of like a root system, but because the entire body of a seaweed is living in its growth medium, in the water column, it doesn't need roots to take up nutrients only from the soil. It's got nutrients coming at it from everywhere. From the holdfast, this structure that kind of looks like a shoot, that's a stipe. And that's just the way that the blades and the rest of the kelp body hold onto the holdfast. These leaf-like structures, they kind of look like leaves, but they're actually called blades. They're very, very flat and thin. And that way, all sorts of nutrients and water just diffuse very easily back and forth through each one of those cells. Oh, I tried to get it.
I was hoping it was going to work.
Okay, so again, we're still in high school biology. I want to talk about photosynthesis real quick because it's going to be super important. So just to review, photosynthesis is how a plant takes in sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water through its roots to produce food in the form of sugars for itself, and it also has a byproduct of oxygen, which it doesn't care about, so it just pitches out into the environment, which is really lucky for us. Okay, so again, photosynthesis, sunlight, carbon dioxide, make sugars, and the plant can grow. You want to give it a second. There we go. Same exact process, same exact structures are happening in a blade of kelp. So those same little cellular processes happen in kelp all the time as well. They just, again, don't have to worry about any dirt because they're entirely surrounded by their growth medium. I'm just going to give you a couple of slides to kind of relax you and look at pretty kelp forests and talk about some of the species that are important for mariculture in Alaska. This is an underwater picture of sugar kelp. So you can see down here, there's a little holdfast holding onto the rock, stipes coming up off of the holdfast, and these are those really pretty, frilly blades. There's some more sugar kelp over here, and it's really yummy. One of the exciting parts. This is a stand of ribbon kelp. They live closer to the surface of the water and shallower waters. So these long structures are the ribbon kelp. And they have all these little tiny pieces of tissue that are coming off of the base near the holdfast that have that source tissue in it. We're actually going to see some up close and personal images. And here are a few residents of kelp forests. This is a bull kelp stand. We have our big old predator right here, a harbor seal that's looking for lunch or trying to hide from a big predator like a shark or a orca. And behind him you can see some fish that are basically doing the same thing. And this is a giant kelp or macrocystis forest. And what I want you to take away from this image is just the amazing amount of different animals that are using the kelp forest. Kelp ecology is incredibly fascinating. It's a huge area of study in marine biology that I kind of now wish I would have gone into. But you can see all of these fish, these forage fish, are using it to hide, growing. It's used as an estuary for other, or sorry, a nursery for other organisms to grow up in. Some live their entire lives amongst the kelp, but it's a very productive ecosystem that promotes quite a bit of biodiversity. So there's a lot of different species that are growing and living. Okay, so this is where it gets fun for you. So a lot of Alaska mariculture, a lot of kelp forests information, you might hear at the same time that you're hearing information about climate change. So I just want to go over quickly why that is, what kelp have to do with climate change, and some of the really cool things that kelp can do. So climate change. I hope that I don't have to go too in depth with what climate change is to this audience because I think you all know. But carbon is the problem, carbon is the key. So we have this structure right here. There's two of these little atoms connected to this big atom in the middle. I'm going to give it a click. There we go. So we've got some oxygen, two oxygens connected to a carbon to get carbon dioxide. So as you all know, carbon dioxide is a huge greenhouse gas, and there's just too much in the atmosphere right now. But keep in mind, every living thing on the planet is made out of carbon. So we're going to talk a little bit about carbon sequestration and how well kelp do this in the next slide. More clicking. Okay, so this is my super simple kelp habitat. So here we just have a rocky bottom that little baby kelp's hanging onto. We have the growth medium, which is the ocean, and then we have sunlight. So if you want to give it a click. Up with the sun and in the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, a heck of a lot of it. There's so much carbon dioxide right now that is actually diffusing into the ocean. There we go. Kelp carbon dioxide. They're really good at absorbing it. Couple clicks. And as they grow, they absorb more and more and more into their bodies. So they're taking out that carbon from the carbon dioxide and growing up to be a big, healthy, carbon-based kelp. So all that kelp, that carbon dioxide that was in the water that we just saw, is now stuck inside of the kelp's body. This is something that happens every day, all over the world, with all photosynthetic organisms, but kelp does something really cool after it dies. So if you want to give it another click. So out in the wild, kelp do exactly what I just talked about, takes up carbon dioxide via photosynthesis, and then at the end of its life cycle, or if there's a large storm that comes through a kelp forest, it breaks off that kelp, the kelp floats out to sea. Over time, it kind of breaks down and it sinks. And if it's in an area of very, very deep water, all of that carbon with all of its kelp will sink all the way down to the deep sea where that carbon is sequestered. So that carbon is pulled out of the cycle at the top of the water column. It can't be put back into the atmosphere. So this is what we call carbon sequestration. You're taking a large amount of carbon out of the environment and you're making sure it doesn't get back into the environment in any way. Just some estimates across the globe. There's still a lot of research going on about what we call wild blue carbon. You're going to hear blue carbon, blue economy, that's all referring to the ocean and ocean systems. In Australia, there's a good study that came out a couple years ago that estimated kelp forests there are able to sequester about 1.4 to 3.1 million tons of carbon per year. Those numbers make no sense to me, so I used a humpback whale as a standard. A humpback whale weighs about 30 tons, so that much carbon is about almost 50,000 to 100,000 humpback whales that are removed out of the system every year. Globally, some work has been done to make some estimations on how much kelp forests remove carbon and carbon dioxide, and that's almost 200 million tons, or 6.4 million humpback whales, which is still a number that doesn't really help in my head, but it is a staggering amount of carbon that is removed. This is in no way really keeping up with the amount of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere, which is one of the reasons why we are looking into kelp mariculture and the ways that we can use kelp and grow kelp to remove carbon from the water column. And kelp mariculture has a lot of ecosystem services on top of carbon sequestration. Kelp farms and shellfish farms also. I'm not focusing that much on shellfish farms because one, I don't know how to grow oysters, and two, our program is mainly focusing on kelp right now. But both shellfish and kelp mariculture filter water, uptake nutrients, and in areas where there's a lot of eutrophication, there's a lot of like agricultural pesticides and fertilizers that are running off into the ocean. Kelp and shellfish can take those nutrients and that eutrophication up and remove it from the water and act as a filter to the water. These farms are also really good at preventing erosion from storm and wave action. Climate change is producing more storms and more severe storms that are causing erosion on coastlines all over the world. If you put up a kelp or shellfish farm, those farms are able to basically absorb quite a bit of the energy coming from those storms and prevent coastal erosion. Like that cool picture we had with the harbor seal and all of the fish, mariculture farms create habitat, both temporary habitat like kelp and permanent habitat like shellfish farms. Shellfish farming, those oyster cages are in the water year-round. With kelp, there are some areas where those farms are growing kelp at key times of year for, let's say, salmon leaving their natal stream. You have a kelp farm right in front of the salmon stream. All those little baby salmon might be swimming out, finding that kelp farm, hanging out for a bit, growing a little bit bigger, and getting a step up on life until that farmer comes and cuts it out. Like I said, carbon sequestration and storage. So if you're ever looking at a kelp product in the market, or you happen to hear restorative or regenerative ocean farming, those terms are used that are referring to these ecosystem services. One of the research questions that we have at NVE is to what extent do kelp farms actually do these? There's a lot of research, a lot of supporting research that they can do quite a bit. The Prince William Sound Science Center is also looking into these questions as well. Just basically the environmental impacts of kelp farms and mariculture in Alaska. Okay, so now we're switching gears and talking about how exactly you grow kelp. How do the kelp farmers in Prince William Sound grow their crops? What do you do with them when you're done growing? So there's 6 basic steps. It's going to require a bit of clicking. The first step is going out and finding wild kelp. We'll talk about why this is important in just a second, but I'm just going to go real quick over all the steps. Once you find your wild kelp, you send it off to a lab, and they grow your seed for you. After that, or during that time, you actually put your farm infrastructure in water so that you have a substrate for those baby kelps to grow on. Then once the kelp is ready, it comes to the farmers and they plant it, and then it just grows. And then finally in the springtime is harvest season. We'll talk about how you harvest. Okay, so how do you grow kelp? How do you find, well, we kind of know where most of the kelp is around Prince William Sound. There was an excellent project called Shore Zone done about 10, 12 years ago that mapped the entire coastline of the Prince William Sound and Alaska and highlighted the areas where kelp live and what species live. So we have a good grasp in our area as to where kelp are growing. But the guidelines and laws right now by the state, if you want to give it another click, require us to go out and find wild kelp for that sori tissue, for that reproductive tissue. So you can't go to the store and just buy a packet of kelp seeds. It's quite more involved than that. You have to go out and actually find live kelp that are growing that sorus tissue. Give it another click. And that sorus tissue only pops up on the kelp seasonally, between about the summertime to fall. You get these really cool patches of dark tissue right here. This is sugar kelp. Over here, these patches, this is bull kelp. And that's where all of the kelp seeds, they're not seeds, they're spores, but it's just an easier analogy, where the kelp seeds are going to come from. So we have to go snorkeling, scuba diving within 30 miles of each farm. The state is being very conservative right now because they don't want any sort of genetic contamination of kelp species between regions of Alaska. So you can't go down into southeast, get your bull kelp there, and bring it to Prince William Sound. They're making sure that the genetics aren't contaminating any system, but there's still quite a bit of work that they're doing. So right now the rule is about 30 miles, 50 kilometers of where your farm site is where you have to find a kelp. So if you want to grow bull kelp in Prince William Sound, you need to get your lease and get your farm site somewhere close to where that bull kelp is growing. Okay. It's also a lot of fun to do at least. Okay, so we have our sorus tissue. What do we do with it then? We clean it up a bit and then send it to the lab. So this past fall, let me give another clip. Dr. Alicia Cipher with the Science Center organized a trip for myself, another NVE employee, and a Royal Oceans kelp farmer named Taya Thomas to go to the Aleutian Fried Marine Institute in Seward to actually do the process of germinating the seeds of kelp and growing them on these tubes. So Dr. Cipher over here has all of those little tiny sori. This is ribbon kelp sori, all those little pieces of tissue that we saw in that picture a little while ago that she's cleaning up. So you clean them up, you dry them out a bit, and then you inspire them to release their spores through exposing them to sunlight and a few other fun different techniques. And once you've done that, in the microscope, what you'll see are all these little teeny tiny specks. Each one of those specks is a little teeny tiny spore. There's a mind-boggling amount of reproductive information I could throw about you with kelp and what those spores actually are, but for right now, it's okay just to think of them as seeds. So this is all of the seed for kelp. You take that seed and you dump it into a big tank with this thing. This is a PVC pipe. It's about 3 inches in diameter. and wrapped around it very, very tightly is about 200 feet or so of 3 to 4 millimeter nylon string. Okay, so you can kind of see some of the little ridges right up here, but it's 200 feet of string that's just wrapped around and around and around and around. The kelp seeds will settle onto that nylon string and start to grow. So once that starts happening, the the lab technician will put it in a room with a bunch of grow lights, and in about 6 to 8 weeks, you have these things. Now this looks like it's just covered in gut, which is exactly what it is. This is what happens on the bottom of your boat every year. So these are those PVC pipes that are covered in kelp string that are now covered in little baby kelps and are ready to be planted. So this is one of the kelp strings that I think Noble Oceans got this year. If you were to pull out a magnifying glass, give it a click, give it another click, put it under the microscope, this is what you would see. So this is about 3 to 4 millimeters, just about that thick of string with all these little baby kelps growing off of it, and they're referred to as sporophytes. Right? So you take that tube, you go out, or you wait until this whole process is finished, and while you're waiting, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, you install your farm. So I'm going to give it a couple more clicks. So everything's happening in the lab, and you're getting ready to actually put your farm structure in. So this is kind of what the farms around Prince William Sound and the rest of Alaska look like. They're rather simple. They're just a series of long lines with buoys attached, and each corner has some sort of anchoring system. And most of these arrays are called catenary arrays. They're about a football field in size. And some of them can have, about 4,000 feet of long line, or what we call grow line, once kelp's growing on them. Some of them can be bigger, some of them can be smaller. But all of this kelp is being grown horizontally at the surface. So these long lines are as close to the surface as possible to get enough sunlight to the kelp. Right? And if you're on a boat, this is what it would look like. So this is in Kodiak at one of Blue Evolution's farms run by Nick Mangini. And then I'm going to click again. This is Noble Ocean Farm in the background. This is Sky Starrett's. She's harvesting her ribbon kelp. You can see right here. Looks very yummy. But behind her, this is where their farm is out in Simpson Bay. And I'll show you where it is in just a minute. If you were to go underwater and have the privilege of going scuba diving around these farms, this is what it would look like. Just a series of lines with a bunch of kelp growing on it. Okay, so your farm's set up. The lab calls and says that your seed is ready and they're sending it to you. So how do you get this stuff onto your farm? It's actually a pretty simple and ingenious process. This is Mariculture from Seagrove Kelp in Southeast, and these are all of his seed spools. You take one seed spool, you put your grow line through that spool, you ask your captain or you put your boat in gear, and you just pull back, hold on to the seed spool, and it flakes out onto your grow line. So here, this seed spool is about halfway done, and you can see this very tiny, darker thread kind of helicking its way down the long line. That's the baby kelp seed line, and that's how you plant your kelp. This happens in October, November, in the fall. And after you've seeded your lines, you let it go. And all that involves is not much. You do have to go out several times a month just to check that your lines are where they should be, that your anchors haven't dragged, and do all sorts of maintenance that you need to. But actually growing the kelp involves nothing on your part as it does in terrestrial agriculture. There are no fertilizers involved. There are no pesticides. There's no freshwater inputs. It just grows throughout the winter through the spring. In the springtime, as sunlight starts to come back and we get longer and longer days, that's when the kelp really, really starts growing. So the end of March through April is kind of the main growing season, but we're still trying to figure out those little intricacies around here right now too. So if you go back to this is a picture I took last week of our kelp out in Sheep Bay. So it was that teeny tiny microscopic little guy that you saw in one of the other images in November. And this is, I think that was about a foot long right now. It's nice to go out there and actually see things growing. Okay, so it's April. Your kelp are really, really big. The season's starting to progress. Lots of, like we talked about earlier with wild kelp forests, lots of things like to live in kelp forests and actually on kelp. So one of the things that kelp farmers have to balance is waiting long enough for their kelp to get nice and big versus the things that are going to start growing on it that people don't want to eat in their salad. So around the end of April right now seems to be a good time, but we're still trying to understand the timing of those little critters that like to grow on kelp when they start settling on kelp in the springtime. So if you go one more. This is just a blown up picture of what I just showed you. I really like this picture. This is from Maine. Because here's all the kelp that they've grown throughout the season, and then this is what the kelp line looks like after they harvest it. So he's got that kelp line up on his boat, and he's just going and whacking it off into his boat. That's how you harvest kelp. It's very simple. This is a picture from last year from Noble Ocean Farms, their Sky Spirits. This is Amber Moore. She's got a farm that she's going to be installing next year. Here is their kelp line that they've cut quite a bit of kelp off already, and I'm probably going to go back and do it again. This is all sugar kelp that they've harvested. This is their harvest of sugar kelp, and then their harvest of ribbon kelp right there. They were able to sell all of their kelp last year in town. I think they had a few buyers from outside of town, but everyone in town really liked kelp. Okay, so you've harvested all of your kelp. You've got several tons of kelp. What do you do with it? What are the markets? What are the products that it can be sold as? Well, you can just sell it as is. This is Noble Ocean's 1 pound package of sugar kelp. They rinse it and blanch it really quick and then vacuum pack it. There's a few processors in the state, Blue Evolution and Barnacle Seafoods, that buys kelp or goes out and does a wild harvest of kelp in the case of Barnacle Seafoods. They've got a ton of different products from pickles to popcorn, all sorts of yummy, delicious seaweed salads and the like. Kelp is incredibly versatile. Not just eating kelp directly like here, but there's some derivatives of kelp that are used in all sorts of foods. You probably used kelp today and you didn't even know it. It's used in toothpastes. It's used in ice creams. If you ever have a package of food and you look on the ingredients and you see carrageenan or agar, those are kelp-derived products, right? And what's really exciting is it can be used to make biodegradable plastics. This is an example. This is a prototype of a water bottle that quickly degrades over time. It can be used in agriculture as fertilizers. So again, remember, we're not using any sort of fertilizers or pesticides to grow this stuff, but then it can go right back into the agriculture industry and be used as fertilizers very simply. So here's an example of a liquid seaweed fertilizer, and it can be used as livestock feed, which is one thing that NVE is focusing on right now as a product. Because there's some really cool things that happen when you feed a cow kelp. Go next slide. So we're going to talk about another greenhouse gas, not CO2 this time, but methane. Methane is a rather significant greenhouse gas, and the cattle and swine industry and agriculture industry is a big producer of methane. Cow burps, not farts, although farts are funny. It's always fun to talk about cow farts, but it's actually cow burps produce quite a significant amount of greenhouse gas. Cattle farms around the world are responsible for about 14.5% of global methane emissions, which is a really significant source of greenhouse gases. But it turns out that when you feed a cow even just a small bit of kelp on a daily basis, it reduces methane emissions in their burps and their farts by about 80% or so. There's still quite a bit of research that needs to happen, but this is another potential avenue to reduce greenhouse gases on top of all the other stuff that we've already talked about. Okay? But again, it needs research like everything. There's still a lot of questions to answer. There's some of this stuff for me sounds way too good to be true, which always makes me a little skeptical. So that's why we're doing what we're doing, is we're asking questions and trying to find some answers. All right, so that's the end of kind of the broad overview of mariculture. Now I just want to go and quickly talk about where mariculture farms are in Prince William Sound and the rest of the state. So this is these little green, they kind of look like feet all over here in southeast in Yakutat, Prince William Sound, and along the coast here are where all of the mariculture leases are in Alaska. Right now, as of today, there are way more leases than there are actual active farms. People are kind of getting their feet under them. The permitting process is ridiculously long and complicated. There was one farm this year that didn't get to plant her kelp because she was waiting on a permit. So there's a lot of leases, not a ton of farms, especially in our area. So we're going to go to the next one. We're going to zoom in on Prince William Sound and take a look at where all the kelp farms are and the shellfish farms. So up here, we have Perry Island Oyster Farm. There are a couple of oyster leases up here, although I'm not sure if they're active or not. But as you can see, the bulk of mariculture leases in the Sound are right here near Cordova. Right? That may change in the coming years. There's several leases right now under review and in the public process. If you have any comments, go to the DNR, Alaska DNR website. There's some farms that are in the public notice period. But if we zoom in once more, we can talk a little bit about where the farms are in our region, and if you're out voting, just places to keep an eye on. Oh, yeah, so there's a mariculture lease that's in process right up here in Jack Bay. That's about 100 acres through the Valdez tribe. And I think if you click again, we're going to go down here to Port Etches. There are several mariculture leases that are in process right now around Port Etches for kelp. And I don't know if there are any shellfish farms that are going in, but I know there's a lot of kelp farms that potentially are going to go in that area. Okay, so zooming in on our area to take a look. All right, so this requires some clicking in just a second. So all of these green boxes are the extent of each lease. That's not to say the entire farm is going to take up that area, especially at the surface. But according to DNR and ADF&G, everybody's anchors have to be within that box. So you might have a 20-acre farm, but really at the surface that translates to about 10 acres because anchor swing and scope and all that stuff. So these are kind of the areas where if you're voting around to keep an eye out. There's one down here, but if you start clicking, so we're going to start out with oyster farms first. Simpson Bay Oyster Company is right here in Simpson Bay. The next oyster farm is down here, Safety Cove Shellfish Farms. And then the next one is going to be here with Eagle Shellfish Company. One of the active kelp farms in Prince William Sound, there are only 3 commercially operating kelp farms right now, is Royal Ocean Kelp Company, which is in Windy Bay. They just planted this past year. Again, Blue Green Enterprises by June Lankard is over here on this side of Simpson Bay, and Noble Ocean Farms has planted their kelp this past fall as well, and they're in operations. And then I think if you click one more time, you'll see Wild Blue Mariculture. This was a permit I was talking about that she didn't get everything in. She was on it and got all of her information in when she needed to. It's just the way life works. She didn't get her permits this year, but next year she will be planting. She'll be using one of those catenary arrays like we talked about. Another click. And this right here is where Native Village of Eak's kelp farm is in Sheep Bay. One thing about these maps is that they do not have the research kelp farms on them. So our program is for research only. We're not a commercial operation, so we can't sell any of our kelp. There are 9 other research spots in the Sound through Native Conservancy. I unfortunately don't know exactly where they are. I know there's one over here, but I couldn't find enough information to present to you guys on where those farms are. And I'm not sure how many are still running as well. Okay. So if anybody wants to snap a picture, this is a QR code that will take you to the ADF&G website and the map that has all of those leases. I'll maybe figure out a way to post this presentation. But if you're ever out tootling about and you need to know where the kelp farms are, this QR code or that website can tell you Right, so this is my first talk for Mariculture. I get to come and visit you guys again next week. Next week, I'm specifically going to be talking about NVE's Mariculture program and the farm that we put in the water. We're growing kelp in a different way than anybody else in Alaska is right now. We're doing it vertically. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the research questions that we're hoping to answer with this farm. Good. So, yeah. If anybody has any questions, there's quite a bit of economic development going on in the state right now too. I'm trying to get Kristen Harper to come in to give you guys a talk about that because she's much better situated to do that. But there's a lot of money floating around. If anybody has any questions?
Caitlin, I have a question. The line used for mariculture, is that a specific type of line?
Excellent question. There's a lot of different kind of experiments that are going on with diameter, what it's made out of, and what works best where. A lot of people just use old long lines. One thing that I'm super excited about that I'll talk about next week is how mariculture is completely set up to reuse old fishing equipment. So reusing old long lines, reusing old anchor lines and old anchors. But the question is, almost anything. There's a lot of opinions about what color to use, what substance works best. We're using nylon at our farm. But yeah, it's kind of every farmer's experiment and trying to figure it out.
Where's the oldest kelp farm in the state?
Ooh, I think that might be Seagrove Kelp in Southeast in Craig, but that's commercially. Mike Steckel, I think he's getting ready to retire as all of this kelp research is starting. He's a big kelp biologist in the state, and he's been growing kelp since at least the 80s, if not the 70s, for research. Because this isn't anything that is new. A lot of the carbon sequestration stuff are things that people have done for a long time. It's just finally getting our feet under us to research how to do it here. So Mike Steckel's been kind of at the forefront of that for the past 30 to 40 years. He started that. I know he did some work in the sound in the late 80s and 90s.
Can you speak a little bit to the regulatory process and the interactions with different agencies? Because I just find that very confusing.
Oh, yeah.
Doing what? I know
Okay.
that might be a big question.
No. Could you click for me
Twice. Back or forward? Oh.
Yeah, I did have a whole economic benefits slide, but I'm going to try to get Kristen on that. This is the roadmap to getting permitting done if you're a commercial kelp farmer. It is laborious and intensive, and you have to talk to the Army Corps, you have to talk to DNR, Fish and Wildlife Service comes into play, ABEC, NOAA, all of these different agencies have to approve your plan. For kelp farmers, they just submit it to one group for the state, and they disseminate that information to everybody else. You do have to submit an Army Corps permit on your own, but this is the process. And I'm not going to explain it because it hurts my brain. And I'm all tired. But it is very intensive.
You're a scientist and not an administrator.
There you go. Yeah, when I was first hired by NVE, we were going towards the commercial kelp farm route. Tribal Council was more interested in research questions, so that's why we went through the research permitting process, which is it's much more streamlined. I mean, any sort of permitting is a pain, but it is not this. There are quite a few resources out there and a lot of organizations that are just there to help you with the permitting process. Native Conservancies working with Native groups in the state to get people leases and to do quite a bit of this work for those interested parties. Green Wave is a nonprofit that started in Maine but is now up here as well, and their whole purpose is to get mariculture resources and all of these questions answered for people. There's quite a bit of work going on at the state level to take over some of these things. But yeah, it's pretty intense. It takes about 2 years to get a permit if you're lucky. I think Amber was in it at about 2.5 years to 3. So the more permits they're getting, the more plugs they're getting, there is a half a person to do all of the aquatic leases in the state at ADF&G. And I've met her, she's very nice somehow. I would be very grumpy if I was that person, but she does all the aquatic farm leases, permitting, and she does all of the research permits as well.
There's a question in the chat. Does NVE plan to test different types of lines, such as polypro versus hemp, in their grow out experiments?
I think that would be fun. We don't have any, right now, anything written to do that. We'll talk about our program next week. But it is a big question that Tamsin Peoples is a researcher in the state. She's working on her master's, I think, at UA Southeast. She's looking at those kind of questions. And especially questions like that for seed line. Because remember, we saw that little teeny tiny 3 to 4 millimeter nylon line, that's all plastic. It doesn't break down in the environment. So one thing that Tamsin was looking at was things like hemp or cotton that would break down slower so that you're not adding more plastic to the environment. Thanks for the question.
Oh, we got one more from the chat. What factors, natural or human, can affect harvest yields?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure yet because we haven't harvested. So I had the privilege of going out with Noble Oceans last year to help with harvest. There was a lot of questions about timing. So like I was saying, there's a sweet spot where your kelp is the biggest before all the little critters start growing on it. There's things like bryozoans and other little filter feeders that grow directly on your kelp that reduce the quality of your product. You know, it's like buying a head of lettuce and seeing a bunch of bugs in it is kind of a good analogy. So they're trying to figure out when those bugs arrive onto the kelp in relation to how big the kelp is. So that's one example of people making that decision when to go out and harvest your kelp. There are some of the kelp that I've seen, when you start shaking the line, it just falls right off. So there's questions about how to get that hold fast to attach onto the line better, which comes back to your question about what kind of grow line to use. So if you use thicker grow line, does that necessarily mean that the kelp have a better hold onto the line? So there are a lot of questions. I hope to have answers for you about that kind of thing next year when we get a better control.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Caitlin. We really appreciate it. Oh, yeah, sorry, it didn't work.
Thanks, Nancy.
Okay, I will.
Nice, there you go.